free-living, cutthroat wildmen whose adventures became legends in their own lifetime. But were these ocean terrorists as glamorous as the tales that surround them? What is the story of the real pirates?
In an honest service, there is low wages and hard labour. In this, pleasure and ease, liberty and power. A merry life and a short one shall be my motto.
The words of Black Bart Roberts, a dashing pirate captain who summed up the lure of this sweet trade of piracy. Defiant of all authority, the only law pirates respected was their own.
Your religion, your color, your sexual preference made no difference. There were no moral judgments. Freebooters, buccaneers, filibusters, people on their own account, people who had chosen a free way of life, if you will, and if that meant robbing from the rich to give to themselves, then that's what they did.
The story of piracy is the story of plunder, and it begins with Spanish gold. When Columbus arrived in the New World in 1492, he found a land of unexpected wealth. The Spanish, sanctioned by the Catholic Church, systematically plundered the treasures of the Incas and the Aztecs. This was melted into doubloons and piastres, which became known as pieces of 8. The newly minted wealth was loaded into galleons and shipped to Spain. Other European nations, envious of this new wealth, but anxious to avoid all-out war, hired adventurers to steal the Spanish gold. These licensed pirates became known as privateers. The most ruthless, the Spanish named El Draco, the dragon, Sir Francis Drake.
Drake was an explosive cannonball of a man full of vanity, ambition, pride, intense religious zeal, vehemently Protestant, vehemently anti-Spain. Spain is the great Catholic champion of the Pope, and he hates the Pope like poison, calls the Pope Antichrist.
Drake was determined to challenge the Spanish dominance of the New World. After 2 years of waiting, he gained an audience with the Queen of England, Elizabeth I. His plan went far beyond anything a privateer had attempted before, and risked provoking a war with Spain. But if it succeeded, it would make Elizabeth a very rich queen.
Drake knew that where the silver came from was on the other side of the continent. That Pacific seaboard is unguarded. It's the soft underbelly of the Spanish Empire. So if you can get there, then you can get to the treasure at source. So he has this idea: he will take a strong force of ships, he'll go round South America, he'll come up the other side and raid along that unguarded Pacific seaboard at will.
On December 13, 1577, Drake set sail with his fleet of 5 ships. His destination was kept secret, even from his own crew. His mission was to rob the Spanish, although the exact terms of the Queen's orders were ambiguous.
Drake would always insist that he had letters from the Queen authorizing him to do what he was doing. No one ever saw his instructions, and so we don't know whether he had or not, but it's really immaterial. You did whatever you could get away with. You haven't got any laws of the sea in those days.
Drake's flagship, the Golden Hind, was only 100 feet in length and 18 feet in beam, but she was fast and well armed. When an exact replica of this famous ship set sail, the cramped conditions of life on board became clear.
So here she is. She's a small ship, crammed with 184 plus men. But within this small space, social distinctions are going to be very clearly kept. And so Drake lives aft there in his own great cabin, because he is the representative of a queen. This is the crew's quarters. They don't go up there. They don't go up to the poop deck. Each man with his own chest lashed down to his favourite place, and that's where he will live, that's where he will sleep. In rough weather, he will move down below to the gun deck and sleep between the guns. But that's the conditions that the serfs live under, and it's totally different from the conditions that the gentleman and the captain live under. Ships were built on various levels for social reasons, to distinguish between the lower orders and the upper orders, and also for the very practical business that this was a fighting ship. And so from this upper level, men would be able to leap onto the decks of a ship that was being grappled, and from the lower level, the guns would fire away into the belly of the other ship.
In 1974, the Golden Hind's voyage across the Atlantic was retraced by Captain Adrian Small, who came to appreciate Drake's seamanship.
We found that he was a much better sea dog than we were. He did things with his ship that we found are very, very difficult to do. They wouldn't attempt to do long passages into the eye of the wind or against the wind like a modern yacht. They let the ship go off before the wind and just sail to another part of the ocean where they might get more favourable winds.
Having crossed the Atlantic, their passage into the Pacific was barred by one of the most dangerous waterways in the world, the Straits of Magellan.
The passage through Magellan Strait would be today considered quite a feat in any sailing vessel, let alone a period galleon. That is a tremendous feat to sail, and in the centuries that followed, sailing ships avoided going through the Strait of Magellan and preferred to go around Cape Horn.
After 6 weeks battling against the wind and the tide of the Magellan Straits, Drake emerged into the Pacific and took the Spanish completely by surprise. Drake swept up the coast of South America, attacking the treasure galleons and plundering the undefended towns. He soon learned that the richest ship in the Pacific was just ahead of him.
Drake has heard about this ship, the Nuestra Señora de la Ascensión, which is working its way up to Panama, loaded with treasure from the silver mines. She's also famed to be a very powerful ship. That's why she's nicknamed the Cacafuego, literally the ship fire.
Drake raced to catch up with the Cacafuego before she learned of his existence. After 4 weeks hard sailing, he finally caught sight of her. The Cacafuego was twice the size of the Golden Hind. To capture her, Drake resorted to some devious tactics.
What Drake does is he throws out a number of loaded wine jars full of water to slow him down, crams on full canvas, and starts moving towards the Cacafuego. And so the Cacafuego, this unknown vessel, looks like a labouring merchantman. She's obviously travelling under full sail, but she's not making very good speed. So, in order to find out who she is, the Cacafuego turns round, comes back towards Drake, and comes alongside. And the captain of the Cacafuego hails this other ship. Who is she? What does she want? Drake's answer is, surrender! Why should I surrender? Laughs the captain of the Cacafuego. And for answer, Drake has one of his culverin fire which carries away the mizzenmast of the Cacafuego. And And while the captain is still wondering what the hell is going on, up from the decks of the Golden Hind appear all these armed men ready to swarm aboard, which they very quickly do. They grapple and get aboard. Cacafuego's no time to fire its guns, no time to arm its men. He's finished. It's a very short, sharp, brilliant engagement, and Drake has taken a superior vessel.
After the bloody battle, dinner was served. The guest of honor, the defeated Spanish captain.
Drake also had an inferiority complex. He's a man on the make, he's a man determined to work his way up and to show that he is just as great as the great nobleman of the realm. And so he is going to surround himself with all the trappings of wealth and splendor. And so when he has the captain of the Cacafuego and his officers on board, he entertains them here in the great cabin. Musicians play in the background, and it's just as though he were a great nobleman holding court in the household of Queen Elizabeth.
As the wine flowed, the Cacafuego was stripped of her riches.
On that treasure ship were 1,300 bars of silver and 14 chests of coin, plus an unspecified amount of private treasure belonging to various merchants. It's a huge amount of money. This was his major haul of the whole trip. To give you some idea, when he got back to England, he was able to pay the backers of the expedition 4,700% return on their investment and provide the Queen with money which was the equivalent of a year's government expenditure. A lot of money.
Drake was rewarded with a knighthood. His success lured many rich merchants and noblemen into the privateering game. In 1 year alone, 1,000 privateering expeditions were launched. But to be as successful as Drake, the privateers would have to match his skill as a navigator.
People like to equate these early ships with space capsules. But you know, there's even a difference there. A space capsule has ground support, communications, and a full range of people assisting them, even though it's quite far away. When these ships left, they literally were entirely on their own.
Chip Reynolds, skipper of a replica galleon, has experienced the navigational difficulties faced by the early privateers.
This instrument, the crossstaff, was essential to tracking the position of latitude. It would be used by sighting celestial objects, the sun, stars, particularly Polaris, the pole star, day or nighttime observations. You would watch the approach of the sun to its point of zenith, and when it reached, then you would take your reading with the crossstaff.
By regularly measuring the angle of the sun to the horizon, privateers sailed along a line of latitude across the Atlantic until they sighted land. The most dangerous part of the voyage was in these shallower waters.
The lead line was really one of the most critical pieces of navigational equipment to transatlantic crossings. The mate or another crew member would be standing on the channel and cast the lead into the bottom. Allow it to pay out until it touches the bottom. Once it touches, the mate observes the knot or the mark that's found there, brings it up, and then they can read the depth right off the line. If they ended up on a sandbank, or if they ended up coming ashore unexpectedly, their vessel was ruined, they were marooned, and probably dead.
A quarter of all privateering expeditions never returned.
People in England tried to make money out of privateering, but it's very difficult when you're 6 months sailing distance. They hoped they'd one day find a richly laden galleon floating towards them totally undefended, or a golden city in the jungle, but more often they actually found a small sloop trading hides or cocoa.
The most elusive prize was the annual flotilla of treasure galleons that gathered in the Caribbean before their journey home. Despite the best efforts of the privateers, these ships were never captured. These islands of the Spanish Main attracted a new group of settlers who in time would develop their own form of piracy. By 1620, several European nations had established outposts in the Caribbean, fighting for possession with their Spanish overlords, who regarded this mass of tiny islands as their own God-given land.
The original settlers were a very mixed group of people, men from many different nationalities, many different backgrounds, who found themselves in the Caribbean and were attracted by life on the frontier. They wanted freedom, they wanted adventure, they wanted excitement beyond the bounds of authority.
On the island of Hispaniola, a group of French pig hunters had settled. These men became known as buccaneers, a name taken from their method of smoke-drying meat, a process called bucanning. In the days before refrigeration, bucanned meat was a valuable commodity and commanded high prices.
They didn't have any stun guns or things like that in those days, so they used the good old method of the knife. The pig gets held up like that, holding two legs together. Then the person with the knife would hold onto the mouth and stick the knife in the throat here, right down, until it reached the heart. And then the pig would be left to bleed to death. A fire is made, and the pig is cut in sections and put on a barbecue or to dry slowly. Takes about 4 hours. The only trouble you have is that you have to go and change because you're full of smoke, the smell of smoke, you see, as if you have been barbecued.
Although passing galleons bore the buccaneers' meat, the Spanish resented the presence of these unruly pigmen, and in 1630 drove them out of the hills.
The buccaneers were chased off Hispaniola by the Spanish, and they became pirates, and they were joined by an assorted bunch of English and Dutch soldiers and seamen and deserters, and together formed this terrifying bunch of young men. They were mostly in their 20s or 30s.
The weapon that I'm handling is called a fusil bucanier, a buccaneer's musket, from the French. This one dates from about 1650 or 1660. Its distinguishing characteristic is the huge length of its barrel. As you see, this one is nearly 6 feet long. With such a weapon, a skilled marksman could bring down a wild pig on the run, or he could pick the helmsman off of an enemy's deck. The buccaneers were good shots. They were very good shots. They were masters in the use of small arms, the first pirates who gave it any attention.
The buccaneers put their sharpshooting skills to good use when attacking ships. One of the earliest accounts of this is by Basil Ringrose, a buccaneer leader.
On this occasion, the pirates used canoes and paddled straight up to the windward side of the ship. Using long-barreled muskets, they shot the helmsman and the crew working the sails, causing the ship to fall away from the wind with her sails flapping. Firing continuously, they rowed up under the stern and with further shots cut through the main sheet, so the ship was totally disabled.
This is what a buccaneer would have looked like coming over the side of a ship preparing to attack. Armed to the teeth, excessively armed. He's got 2 flintlock pistols, he's got 2 cutlasses, and probably tucked away in a pocket somewhere, he's got a couple of hand grenades to throw on deck to cause maximum terror. And he's got here a jacket covered with pitch or tar, which gives some sort of protection from sword wounds. And you can see if you sort of saw into that, it provides some sort of protection. How does it actually feel in all that gear?
Extremely uncomfortable, hot and heavy.
They were battle-hardened terrorists, really. They weren't nice people. They were quite capable of using their weapons. They were extremely accurate shots. They would have been good at sword play. They would have been effective with cutlasses. They were a nasty and terrifying lot of people.
The pistol was the boarding firearm of the pirate, good for 1 shot. Bang, and then, because it was a big heavy thing, you threw it at the enemy. As soon as your enemy is about 10 feet away from you, that was the preferred distance. But at that range, they were deadly effective. Well, let's see how seriously we've inconvenienced our enemy here. It's gone right in there, and it's come out right there. The problem, of course, was that it would carry a piece of your shirt, your coat, in with it, and although they might be able to dig the ball out, they would never get the fragments of garment, with the result that the wound would certainly fester. You'd probably die of gangrene if the bullet didn't kill you outright. And so that's his lot. The grenade, a favorite weapon of the pirates. Spherical cast iron ball, about 5 inches around, loaded with 5 ounces of gunpowder. Fused with a wooden fuse, hollow with a compound in it, driven home and sealed with wax so that no stray spark could get into it. When it was lit, it took about 6 seconds to go off, and you could throw it about 90 feet. The blunderbuss, a favorite shipboard weapon. We're told it was Blackbeard's favorite. It was loaded with a handful of pistol balls, and when it was fired, it would create absolute devastation over a broad area of decks. It had to be fired like this, from this position, so that when it recoiled, and its recoil was massive, it would be cushioned that way. If you made the mistake of putting it to your shoulder, it would break your shoulder. But all the firearms were one-shot weapons, then they had to be reloaded. The backbone of any boarding action was the cutlass, a thrusting weapon or a cutting weapon, used over and over. It was short so that you didn't get the blade hung up in the rigging if you were handling it on deck, and also you could swing it in a tight-packed group of men.
Buccaneer tactics were simple and effective. By 1665, 15% of all Spanish gold ended up in their hands. They not only stole the treasure, they often took the ship as well.
Pirates, on the whole, preferred small, fast ships. I mean, I think one of the problems with the movies is in the past they've always shown these vast pirate galleons. In fact, the records show that the pirates preferred small brigs and ideally what were called sloops, which we would call today a gaff cutter, which was a single-masted vessel in those days with a very big mainsail. And they were very fast and they were very big. They were often up to 70 foot in size and could carry a crew of 50 to 100 men.
Speed gave the pirates the advantage over their prey, and they soon became skilled at making their vessels even faster, as master sailmaker Alf Redmond explains.
To make yourself go faster, you put up more canvas, but you would try and get sails that spill the wind quickly. If you can spin the wind quickly and get rid of it, then you get more wind in and you increase your airflow, and that's one way of, other than increasing the sail area, it's another way of increasing your speed. If we had a sail, say, that shape there, if you want to increase the airflow on this, all we could do is take a section out of here. If we couldn't increase the sail area, just take a section out up the trailing edge, what we call the leach. Cut that section out. It's like cutting part of a hole in it. It will spill the wind that much quicker. And if it does that, it leaves a bit more room for more air to come in. It increases your airflow, and airflow is power. Because the ship would want to be in a good state itself, you know, for seaworthy and fast if possible. If they could find a faster one, I'm sure they'd use it.
But even the fastest ship will eventually be slowed down by seaweed, barnacles and worms that attack wooden hulls.
Barnacles, 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 worms, worms, worms. Well, if you leave it in the water 2 months, 3 months, you'll have a lot of work to do to clean it up, because the barnacles and the worms will eat through. When they eat in the wood, they eat in just bore one hole and go in and eat everything inside and live inside. But when you get a knock, bro, you see all inside is eat up, you know, like it hollow like a cardboard, you know.
Then, as now, the only solution was to beach the ship and scrape up the worms and barnacles, a process called careening. The pirates were at their most vulnerable to Spanish frigates when their ship was beached, so they needed a safe haven. The most popular base was in the center of the Caribbean on the island of Jamaica, where the British had established a colony, Port Royal. Early governors would offer a privateering commission to any cutthroat who would help protect the colony by harassing the Spanish. Needing no further encouragement, buccaneers from all over the Caribbean flocked to the town to join in the plunder of the Spanish Main.
Privateering was an ideal startup trade for a new colony. It required very little in the way of capital investment, and it offered very quick returns. Though the islanders gained security and the buccaneers gained access to what was the best port and the best market for prize goods in the Caribbean.
What happens is really quite amazing. Here we are sitting at the end of a peninsula that surrounds perhaps one of the seventh largest natural harbour in the world, which has no water, has no other amenities to support life, and yet still becomes the launching port for maritime terrorism, which is really what the buccaneers were. They were licensed terrorists. Port Royal by 1692 is a town of some 8,000 persons, certainly much larger than New York even became 20 years later, and a crossroads of the Asian, African, and European continents, a melting pot, a cosmopolitan city.
Port Royal rapidly gained a reputation as the wickedest city on earth. Drunken buccaneers blew their fortunes in the brothels, gambling dens, and rum shops. The quayside taverns became the meeting place for every outlaw in the Caribbean. A priest, newly arrived from England, described the lifestyle he encountered.
Since the majority of the population consists of pirates, cutthroats, whores, and some of the vilest persons in the whole world, I felt my presence there was of no permanent use.
He left on the very same ship. Richard McClure has collected the remnants of Port Royal's wild past.
Well, these are wine bottles, or onion bottles as they are called. The late 17th century, you find wine bottles all over the place in vast quantities. A lot of the wine was weak stuff, and they'd sooner drink the wine than drink the bad water. You'd imagine it would be more healthy to drink the wine and the water.
Hello there, sir.
Of course, if you overdid it, that's another thing. Now we have some pewter tankards here. It's patterned off the work of a silversmith. It's a poor man's silver. And the thumb piece here on the lid is interesting. It's a Bacchus head, god of drink, and a very elaborate handle. Very nice piece. Probably French. After the drinking comes the cure for the hangovers, the pharmaceutical bottles. This is a little collection here of drug bottles. And also they have to go with these things, the syringes, you see. And this is a nice big one. Don't ask me what the medicine was that went in it. They had all sorts of strange things that they took. Clay pipes, which we find, there's thousands. Everybody smoked in those days. See, a pipe was very cheap. You go into a tavern, they give you a pipe bowl. You drop the pipe, you have a very delicate thing. I mean, you'd be talking and flourishing, brandishing a hand, snap goes the stem, you get another pipe. This one has been smoked. You can see where the tobacco has burnt it. You can easily match up the maker's names with the initials on the pipe. L.E. Llewellyn Evans. It's a Welsh pipe maker.
Evidence of Port Royal's cosmopolitan past can also be found in the people today.
My name is Maureen Dowie, and I'm from Port Royal, but my grandfather was Cuban.
My grandfather is from Ireland.
My mother's Jamaican, my father's English.
Well, my father was more African orientated. My mother is between Scottish and German.
Port Royal's most famous son was a Welshman. He arrived in 1665 and would unite the buccaneers into the most formidable fighting force the Caribbean had ever seen. His name was Henry Morgan.
Henry Morgan was, in a way, the man that the buccaneers were all waiting for. One of his uncles was a major general. The other was a lieutenant colonel who actually became lieutenant governor of Jamaica. So he knew about military tactics. It was in his blood, as it were.
Morgan served his apprenticeship and learned the classic methods of a buccaneer hit-and-run raid. After landing on a deserted beach, the buccaneers would march overland and enter a town by the back door. They liked to arrive early on Sunday morning, when the citizens were at church.
They usually concentrated on attacking towns which lay outside the main treasure routes, which were much less well defended. Some towns had been plundered 3, 4, 5, 6 times in the 1660s, and clearly these people were running into diminishing returns.
Morgan's insatiable appetite for more loot drove him to attack larger towns. Soon his heart was set on the richest prize of all, Panama, the golden hub of the Spanish Empire.
Panama was chosen for two reasons. The buccaneers were pretty sure they'd find masses of gold and silver there. And the second thing was it had a sort of symbolic reason. It was the great Spanish city in the center of America, and if they could capture it and better still burn it to the ground, it would wipe out Spanish influence for a time and be very shaming for the Spanish.
Panama City lay on the Pacific coast. The Spanish thought it was safe because it was protected from the pirates of the Caribbean by 80 miles of jungle. To take Panama, Morgan would need to recruit an army. And that's what he did. The rendezvous point was off the south coast of Hispaniola. 38 ships and over 2,000 men answered his call. It was the largest force of buccaneers ever assembled. Morgan's plan was simple and daring. He would sail to the mouth of the Chagres River and overwhelm the Spanish fort. From there, he would continue upstream by canoe. Morgan's aim was to take the Spanish completely by surprise. One of those who accompanied him was Alexander Exquemeling, a Dutch surgeon who kept a diary of the campaign.
As we went further up the river, we heard Indians howling in the distance and crying, "Ha perros, a la selva! Go to the jungle, ye dogs!" None of us knew what terrors lay ahead.
At the top of the Chagres River, Henry Morgan abandoned the canoes. The river was too shallow by that stage, and from that point on they were simply hacking through the jungle. I think it's impossible for us really to understand, the conditions they were facing. There were clouds of mosquitoes biting them all the time, all sorts of nasty creatures. There would be leeches clinging onto their feet as they went through the water.
It wasn't just insects and leeches that plagued the advancing buccaneers. Indians frequently ambushed the stragglers and gave away their whereabouts to the Spanish. So when they arrived in villages, they found them abandoned. There was no livestock, no food, no water. Even the wells were poisoned. The buccaneers became so hungry, they were forced to eat their own boots.
First, they took the leather and sliced it into pieces. Then they did beat it between two stones and rub it, often dipping it in the water of the river to render it supple and tender. Lastly, they scraped off the hair and boiled it upon a fire, cut it into small pieces and ate it, helping it down with frequent gulps of water. Some persons who were never out of their mother's kitchens may ask how these pirates could swallow and digest these pieces of leather. To them, I say, if they ever experienced such famine as the buccaneers did, they would certainly do the same thing.
After 9 days and 80 miles trek through the jungle, the starving buccaneers finally reached the Great Plain in front of Panama City.
At 7 a.m., Henry Morgan brought his men out of the forest, out onto the plain, and they marched steadily towards the city. Don Juan, the governor of Panama, had got his men all lined up in front of the road into Panama. Nearly 2,000 men, including horsemen. The catch is that only 300 of them are professional soldiers. The rest are black servants, farmers, civilians who've just been recruited to fill up the numbers. And they're faced by 4 squadrons of hardened buccaneers, including a particularly terrifying lot of French marksmen with muskets that could fire longer range than the Spanish.
Each side took up their battle positions. The buccaneers claimed the ground to the east of the city, so the sun would be in the enemy's eyes.
Morgan sends one of his squadrons to capture a hill which he sees overlooks the battlefield, and the Spanish think that he's actually retreating for some odd reason and broke ranks and started to attack in total chaos. The Spanish army, such as it was so demoralized that they simply turned tail and ran, and Don Juan much too late, decided to bring in his secret weapon, which was these 2 herds of cattle, which he hoped to drive through the buccaneer ranks. The noise and the din frightened the cows, and they turned round and rampaged back through the retreating Spanish ranks. It was a complete farce. At the end of perhaps an hour of battle, sporadic fighting, the Spanish had 500 dead lying on the battlefield, and Morgan lost no more than 15.
Don Juan was determined that if the buccaneers took Panama, they would find nothing. Much of the treasure had already been hidden, and he gave orders to destroy everything else. For several hours, there was chaos as the Spanish soldiers set their own city on fire. When the buccaneers arrived, their hopes of finding treasure were vanishing in the flames. Moving from house to house, they tortured anyone left behind who refused to hand over their gold. But the most valuable object was still undiscovered. As the mayhem approached the cathedral, a resourceful friar hastily slapped a coat of whitewash over the great golden altar. The altar was still wet, but the trick worked, and the buccaneers missed the biggest prize of all.
They came away with 175 mules loaded with silver ingots and gold, something like £2 million, $3 million, which divided between over 1,000 men didn't come to very much, and there was a lot of aggravation at the end of it that Morgan had cheated them. They felt that the men didn't get what they deserved.
How much of the Panama treasure Morgan kept for himself remains a mystery. According to legend, this silver in Port Royal Church is part of his personal booty from the expedition. For Spain, the loss of this treasure was trivial compared to the far-reaching political consequences for their empire. The Queen of Spain wept when she heard of Panama's rape and destruction. She demanded the head of Morgan the pirate as retribution. The British took a somewhat different view. To appease the Spanish, Morgan was arrested and sent back to London. But when he arrived, he received a hero's welcome and was returned to Jamaica as Sir Henry Morgan, Lieutenant Governor. As an official of the British government, Morgan was now expected to arrest the very pirates who had helped him raid the Spanish Main.
He was a great buccaneer leader, but he was absolutely not a great bureaucrat. And of course he was expected to attend council meetings, and he didn't, and he just took to drink and having a good time with his mates in the local taverns.
It's really sad. His last few years he was very ill. He was drinking far too much and just died peacefully on his ranch. His doctor said he died of drink and staying up too late. He was one of the few buccaneers to come to a relatively peaceful end.
Morgan died on August 25th, 1688. A 22-gun salute was fired and a public holiday declared. It was the last time that a pirate would be feted on a British colony. 4 years later, Port Royal would face its own Judgment Day. In 1692, the ground opened up and half the city slipped into the sea, in a huge earthquake. Thousands perished. The submerged ruins of Port Royal are now all that remains of the wickedest city on earth. And the buccaneers, who had once been so useful in establishing British colonies, were now outlawed. But the story of piracy does not end here. Despite losing their license to plunder, the pirates would find new harbors and continue to be the scourge of the seas. The next 30 years would become known as the Golden Age of Piracy.
Pirates of the period 1680 to 1725 were at war with every country on the face of the earth. We estimate that there were between 5,000 and 10,000 individuals involved in piracy one way or another, under the command of 70 different captains.
The pirates of the Golden Age regarded every ocean as their playground, and in particular, the fragile trade routes opening up from Europe and the colonies to the east. Ivory and precious stones from Africa. Gold from the New World. Silks and spices from India. All crossed the oceans in unguarded treasure galleons, and the pirates had a field day. These raids began to pose a real threat to world trade. But the European navies were too busy fighting wars with each other to intervene. Well aware of this, an old sea dog approached the British government. His name was William Kidd. Kidd was a retired privateer living in New York when he obtained a commission to hunt down pirates. The government had little idea of his real intentions. Within 2 years, he would become the most famous pirate in the world. The transformation from Kidd the Pirate Hunter to infamous pirate began in the taverns of New York, where Kidd hired his crew. The deal he offered these men was unusual. There would be no wages, only a share of any captured pirate loot.
Gunner's mate.
And no prey, no pay contract.
I'm not sure that pirate hunting was all that they had in mind. He recruits crewmen. Among them are men that he knows to be pirates. Some of those men were sailors who had run away with his own ship 10 years earlier. Would he have hired them if he had honest intentions in mind?
My name is William Kidd. When I sailed, my name is William.
In 1696, Kidd set sail with his motley crew, bound for the East Indies. Conditions on board were terrible, but no worse than any other ship of the period, as the wit Samuel Johnson once said.
No man will be a sailor who has contrivance enough to get himself into a jail. For being in a ship is being in jail with the chance of being drowned. A man in jail has more room, better food, and commonly better company.
Now, of course, here we have the forecastle.
And the ship's galley.
The irony, of course, is that it was only in pleasant conditions with sunshine and nice, easygoing situations that you would actually have hot food. Something like this, where you really needed the hot food, as you can see, it would be impossible to maintain the fire, and you're living off of cold gruel and a hunk of bread.
Yeah. The bread would usually be infested with either weevils or maggots, and it's my understanding that Royal Navy men preferred it when it was infested with maggots, on account of the weevils left a bitter aftertaste. Kids men, as an extra bit of a treat, would have a piece of cheese as part of their ration, but even that had its own special horrors because there was a long, thin, and nasty worm that dwelt in the bowels of the cheese that was particularly wretched and horrendous and vile tasting.
After 3 months of wretched labor and not a pirate ship in sight, Kidd's crew began to grumble. When one man complained to his face, Kidd snapped. Gunner William Moore died 2 days later.
He was a hard-driving, strong-willed captain. The kind of strong-willed captain that could easily cause a crew to mutiny. On the other hand, the kind of strong-willed captain who would often succeed.
Kidd knew his crew were on the verge of mutiny, but his luck was about to change. On the horizon was an unarmed Indian merchantman, the type of vessel Kidd was supposed to protect from pirates. Kidd noticed that the Quetta merchant was flying a French flag of convenience. Because Britain and France were at war, he knew she was technically a legal prize. He decided to come alongside. His next move sealed his fate. The pirate hunter became a pirate. Down below was a treasure trove of gems and silks. Leaving behind their old leaking ship, they set sail for home. When the Indian merchants discovered Kidd's theft, they threatened to stop all further trade with Britain until he was brought to justice. This threat was enough to sign Kidd's death warrant. When Kidd heard he was the most wanted pirate in the world, he took steps to bury his loot. And the legend of Captain Kidd's lost treasure was born. He may have hidden it on an island in the South China Sea. Nothing has ever been found. Several months later, when he reached the Caribbean, Kidd abandoned the Quetta merchant. It was never seen again, and there are rumors that he buried more treasure among these islands. In the autumn of 1699, he was sighted again in a small sloop in Long Island Sound. Only here, on Gardiner's Island, has the last of his buried treasure been found.
738 3/4 ounces gold, 847.5 ounces silver, 6 bales of precious cloth, muslin, silks, cloth of gold, produce of the Indies. This is where it all began. All the marvelous treasure hunting stories that have entertained us through childhood. For it's here that in 1699, Captain Kidd's buried treasure. It's perhaps the most famous buried treasure of all time.
But Kidd would never return to Gardiner's Island. He was arrested and sent back to London for trial. The recovered treasure was used to pay the investors of his failed expedition. Only one small piece of that treasure now remains.
This is a small piece of what was then known as cloth of gold, silk with gold thread woven through it. Well, according to Gardner family tradition, Kidd was so grateful for a dinner of roast pork that Mrs. Gardner had prepared for him that he gave her this silk cloth of gold, and that it was then made into dresses for her daughters, and that a portion of one of these dresses was kept as a family heirloom.
On May the 23rd, 1701, Captain Kidd was led from Newgate Prison down to the gallows at Execution Dock on the banks of the Thames. A crowd of 200,000 people turned up to see the notorious pirate hang. Some hoped he might reveal the whereabouts of his treasure, but his drunken tirade revealed nothing. Bad luck dogged him to the end. When the noose was placed around his neck and he was swung off, the rope broke. Captain Kidd had to be hanged twice. His body was coated in tar and wrapped in chains. For 4 years it was left hanging at the entrance to the Thames, a warning to passing ships of the price of piracy. But in 18th century England, you could be executed for stealing a chicken. Many young men preferred to take their chances as a pirate, rather than risk the danger that lurked in every port. At the time, Britain was at war with Spain, France, and the Netherlands, and her ships were always short of crew.
There was 850 men in this ship, and 60% were not on board a class of ship like this voluntarily. They were seconded, and it was legal to do that. They were pressed men, hence the press gangs. The ship's company would go ashore and take a quantity of people off the streets to bring them on board, and that's where they stayed. So there were 600 people on board not wanting to be here. And so in order to get them to do what you wanted them to do, you had to have a strict discipline regime, and there was. For an example, if you had a situation where you had theft on board, then the perpetrator would have probably run the gauntlet. Running the gauntlet would have been, you have 50% of the ship's company on one side of the ship, 50% of them on the other side in a row, and the perpetrator would have been invited or ordered, or actually at the end of a bayonet would be tasked to go from one end to the other through these row of people. Each person was given a rope's end, and as the poor man went through, he was then whacked across the back or the legs or the head or wherever until he got to the other end. And they all felt empowered. And the bloke really felt as if he deserved what he got, because everybody felt better, except for the perpetrator, of course.
More serious offences were punished by flogging. A sailor awarded this punishment had the added pleasure of making the cat o' nine tails, which would be used to beat him. In the Navy, floggings often took place on a Sunday after church. The ship's company would assemble on deck to witness the spectacle. It could last up to an hour.
Everybody knew exactly where your boundaries were. And if you crossed those boundaries, then you would be punished if you were found out. And that actually was a very good, strict way of controlling 60% of the ship's company that didn't want to be here. So they knew where their boundaries were, rather like children.
Rather than be treated like children, many Royal Navy men and merchant sailors jumped ship to become pirates. They joined an international brigade.
One gang, for example, that was composed not only of Englishmen, Irishmen, Scots, and Welsh, but there were also Frenchmen, Dutchmen, Swedes, North Germans, Belgians, colonials of all different ancestries, Native Americans from 2 separate tribes, and some 50 persons of African heritage, either former slaves, runaway slaves, or freemen.
Some of the most valuable ships captured by pirates were slavers. The unfortunate human cargo was treated like any other commodity. They were usually sold on, but the fittest slaves were sometimes invited to join the pirate crew.
For a black man who was captured by pirates meant that he had a unique opportunity. Because on board pirate vessels, blacks were treated as equals. We know that some blacks were elected as officers and captains of predominantly white crews. Some of the most successful pirates in history were black men. And it's a terrible irony that during the early 18th century, perhaps the most powerful place for a black man in the Western world was the deck of a pirate ship.
This principle of equality was fundamental to the way the pirates ran their ships.
Piece, pistols and cutlass, clean and fit for service.
They had rules, or articles, which each man was expected to sign at the start of a voyage.
No striking one another on board, but every man's quarrels to be ended on shore at sword and pistol.
Every man has a vote in the affairs of the moment. We're dealing with the first democracy in some sense. Every man to be called fairly in turn by list on board of prizes, meaning everybody gets a proper share. The lights and candles to be put out at 8 o'clock at night. No striking one another on board. If you had a beef, you took your squabble ashore. No man to talk of breaking up their way of living till each had shared 1,000 pounds.
To make that kind of fortune, the pirates were drawn to the richest seas in the world.
The Caribbean was an ideal hunting ground for the pirates. In the first place, the weather was a damn sight better than the North Sea or the North Atlantic, and pirates like good weather. But the main thing was it was on major trade routes. Ships coming from Africa across to America all went through the Caribbean. And for a pirate on the run, and of course they were always on the run from the authorities, it provided literally thousands of hiding places.
"30 years after the demise of Port Royal, the pirates created a new base in the Caribbean. The island of New Providence in the Bahamas had become a pirate republic. It was governed by the pirates themselves. Here are some of the most feared outlaws gathered, many immortalized by Captain Johnson, who wrote the first history of the pirates. One of the most notorious was a young hellcat, Anne Bonny.
Anne Bonny was the illegitimate daughter of a solicitor. She rather disgraced her father by running off with a man who Captain Johnson describes as being not worth a groat. I think he was a sailor, and disappointed her parents' expectations. And it also mentions in the story that she had a ferocious temper. I mean, there's one anecdote that she actually sliced off a woman's nose in an argument.
By the time she reached New Providence, Anne had abandoned her husband and fallen for a dandy young pirate. His name was Jack Rackham. To his friends and enemies, he was known as Calico Jack.
The appeal of piracy to women would have been huge. I mean, it was all about escape. It was about escaping the confines of home and children. And young girls would often dream about running off to sea in the same way that boys would.
Together, they stole a sloop from the harbor and went off in search of prizes. Within days, they struck lucky and attacked a Dutch merchant ship bound for Jamaica. On board, the only person who could speak English was a delicate young boy who caught Anne's eye. The boy's name was Mary Read.
One of the points of similarity between Mary Read and Anne Bonny's story is that Mary Read was also illegitimate. She, however, was raised as a boy from birth because her brother had died. Her brother, who was legitimate, had died, and her mother was sort of passing Mary off as her brother to her mother-in-law in order to get some sort of family income and support. And at the age of 13, her mother had fallen on hard times and sends Mary off to be a kind of serving man, serving boy to a Frenchwoman.
Bored by household chores, Mary ran away to Flanders, fighting in the wars of Spanish succession as a cavalryman. When the wars were over, she disguised herself as a sailor and joined a Dutch ship bound for Jamaica. How did Mary Read conceal her true identity in a small ship surrounded by men? After 10 years' experience sailing on tall ships, Nikki Alford can well imagine the hardships that Mary faced.
I think disguise would have been very difficult. I guess they could have cut their hair short, worn loose clothing. Mostly it's your hands and your feet get very rough and worn. Everyone runs barefoot everywhere, and it's all rope. And your hands, of course, from pulling on ropes, it's like a friction burn, and you get very hard calluses on the palms of your hands and on your fingers. That's about the most change, apart from, of course, big upper body muscles. Everyday life would have been quite hard, the actual personal side of it, like going to the toilets. You'd possibly get away with it at night by creeping up forward onto what were the heads, is the cat heads. They're big wooden pieces of timber where the anchors are hung, and hung yourself off there like the rest of the men. Just go at night rather than in the day.
When Anne Bonny and Mary Read were at sea, they were beyond the normal conventions of society. The men accepted them as equals and learned to respect their ferocity in battle.
They were as fierce as any of the male pirates that you can imagine. When they were finally trapped by a British frigate and their ship was being overwhelmed, their crew fled below decks, leaving only the women on deck, fighting like demons.
The two women remained defiant to the end, but their pirate days were over.
That they, the said Mary Read and Anne Bonny, alias Bon, did wickedly consult and agree together to go with Jack Rackham and rob and...
When Mary Read and Anne Bonny were tried in 1720, it caused a huge sensation, both in Jamaica and back in England. It was the first time that there was hard, concrete evidence that women actually had been pirates. I mean, there was plenty of sort of stories about them and ballads about them, but this was the first time that we knew they really existed. And it was as if a fantasy had been made real.
As the trial unfolded, the daring deeds of Anne Bonny and Mary Read soon passed into legend.
Just 1 and 36 months she braved the tempest cold and always done her duty did.
Terrified witnesses came forward to testify against them.
Both of the women were very profligate, cursing and swearing much. They did not seem to be kept or detained by force.
The two women wore men's trousers. Each of them had a machete and a pistol and cursed and swore at the men to murder me. I knew they were women by the largeness of their breasts.
Anne and Mary remained silent in court. They were destined for the gallows. But they shared one last secret that might save their skins.
They were tried, they were sentenced to hang, but they couldn't hang the ladies because they were both pregnant. And under English common law, that was something that you couldn't do. And so they escaped the hangman's noose. Mary Read had her infant, And they both died of fever in the tropics in Jamaica. And Bonnie, no one knows what happened to her, but she didn't hang.
The lives of the women pirates became folklore. Elsewhere in the Caribbean, it was business as usual.
In the Caribbean, there was a standard method of attack. The pirate ship would see a ship on the horizon, it would come closer and it would shadow that ship for quite a while, working out how many men there were on board, whether it was well armed, whether it was worth attacking. They would then move up closer, probably flying friendly flags in order to lull the crew into a sense of security. They might even come right up close and ask for water or something like that. And then at the last moment, all the crew would appear on deck, maximum noise, maximum terror. Most merchant ships in the Caribbean had tiny crews with perhaps a few token cannon. A pirate ship was loaded with men. Even quite small pirate ships had crews of 50, 60, very often 200 or 300 men. It was a totally unequal battle.
Intimidation was everything, and the pirates' most potent symbol of terror was the black flag.
Bones, skeletons, skulls, crossed femurs, sometimes a bony hand. They were all symbols of death, death being what the victim could expect if he didn't surrender pronto. The earliest pirate flag was a plain red field. The Joli Rouge, the French called it, meaning the pretty red. The English called it the bloody flag. It was in use until about 1700, at which point it was replaced by the black flag. The black flag. This one, the classic skull and crossbones, used by several pirates in the early 1700s, but all pirates made their own flag with their own variations.
The pirates hoped to take the ship without a shot being fired. With no surrender, there was only one course of action: to fire a broadside.
Get in fire!
The deadly effects of a cannonball hit have been analysed by armourer Colin Herriot.
Well, as you can see, the cannonball hasn't come right the way through the wall of wood. It's stuck in there, but it has pushed out these great big jagged splinters which are just about to detach themselves. And that's only with a 6-pound arm ball. Imagine the devastation of a 24-pounder or a 32-pound cannonball coming through a wall of wood like this. A shower of splinters everywhere. Absolute hell on earth. But I think we're going to have to try again, and this time we're going to put a little bit more gunpowder down the gun. We'll slam her in a bit harder for you. Well, I suppose we're about 25-30 yards, fairly close for a small gun. This was the range that these would be firing at, which gives us the ability to fire with a flat trajectory or point blank. The phrase point blank now come to mean firing very close, but in its original form it meant to fire at a flat trajectory. So you had to be fairly close. And that's what we're going to do. Yes. Now that's more like it. These are the splinters I've been telling you about. So imagine those flying everywhere. Look at the point on them. Jagged, horrible. Kill anything. The whole point of a cannonball is to smash through the hull, to cause damage. It's not the cannonball which kills people, although a cannonball hitting somebody will make a nasty mess of them. It's the splinters, the debris. They are the real killers. Cannonball does the smashing and the splinters do the rest. On the cat, give him fire!
There was no anaesthetic, there was no antiseptics. And from bitter experience, they knew that unless the limb was amputated, it would usually mortify, as they would call it, go gangrenous, get infected. And probably the only effective way of dealing with a severe injury of the limb was to amputate it. Poor seaman's brought down, let's say, with a compound fracture of his leg from a cannonball. We'd put him on the operating table. His mates would put a bit of leather between his teeth to stop him screaming too much. Another man to hold up the leg. Now I've got to try and stop the bleeding as much as possible. If I had anybody skilled, if I had a surgeon's mate, I'd get him to press on the femoral artery. That would reduce the bleeding considerably. Probably I wouldn't have anybody as skilled as that, so I'd put a tourniquet round the thigh to stop the bleeding. Very painful, but still effective. And then I'd have to fashion the skin flaps and cut through the muscle so that the skin flaps would flap back over the stump of the bone, like so. Having done that, I would make my skin incision using my amputation knife, as long and as sharp as I can get. Cut through the skin flaps, cut through the muscle, discard my knife, pick up my saw, saw through the tibia and fibula, the two bones of below the knee. Whole thing should have taken 30 to 60 seconds if I'm skillful. Pick up the main arteries with forceps, pull them down, tie them off with a piece of silk or a piece of thread. Put a dressing on, take off the tourniquet, end of procedure. Give the patient a couple of opium tablets, plus or minus a good slug of rum. Take him off the table.
50% of amputees would die within the first year of gangrene. Losing a limb was very common, so stories of one-legged pirates like Long John Silver were based on harsh reality. This prompted the pirates to invent one of the first welfare systems in the Western world.
One of the most surprising things about pirates is the medical insurance scheme which pirates established if they lost limbs in battle. The convention was that the right hand or the right arm was the most valuable, so if you lost that you got 500 pieces of 8, the left hand was 400 pieces of 8, so much for a leg, and if you lost an eye you just got 100 pieces of 8. It says a lot for the way they determined their rule in a very undemocratic age.
So, did the real pirates have hearts of gold like the swashbuckling heroes of the movies? Were they as honorable and fearless as Hollywood portrayed?
It's important not to think of the pirates as heroes. They shouldn't be. They were hard, brutal, and vicious men. While many of the gangs were described as decent and humane even by their victims, there were crews out there who would have made extraordinarily good studies in group sociopathology. Pirate brutality lived up to anything that we've seen in the movies, and worse.
The cruelest form of punishment used by the pirates in cinema was walking the plank. But there is only one recorded incident of this ever taking place. Real pirate torture was much more sadistic. They would torture their victims for information about treasure, or sometimes just for revenge.
They particularly went for the captain, and if it was discovered that the captain had been cruel to his crew, They would simply cut his throat and throw him overboard, or torture him before throwing him overboard. It was the pirates getting their own back, really, because most of them were former seamen, getting their own back on the people who persecuted them in the past.
Some tales of pirate torture are particularly gruesome. One captain made the mistake of throwing his treasure overboard. His punishment was to have his lips hacked off and boiled in front of his face. Another psychopathic pirate specialized in slitting open his victim's belly and forcing him to dance away from his unraveling gut. Pirates reserve the worst punishment for each other. Marooning, or being abandoned on a desert island, a fate that today we might regard as paradise. But left with only one bottle of water and a pistol, the marooned pirate faced almost certain death. And it was this punishment that inspired one of the greatest stories of survival on a desert island, Robinson Crusoe.
Robinson Crusoe was certainly the most famous of all castaways, but Daniel Defoe based him on a real character who was Alexander Selkirk. He was a Scottish pirate who was on a privateering expedition. He had an argument with his ship's captain, who left him on the island of Juan Fernandez. He was left with a certain amount of gear. He had a pistol and a hatchet and a knife and a Bible, which he always maintained kept him going through the hard times. He was actually there for 4 years and 4 days, and when he was eventually picked up, he could hardly speak any English.
Selkirk survived by preying upon the island's goats, left by earlier Spanish sailors. He killed them by chasing them off cliffs. When bored, he taught his goats to dance and overcame his melancholy by singing psalms loudly to himself. He claimed he was a better Christian when he was marooned than he ever had been before or would be again. Alexander Selkirk was rescued by Captain Woodes Rogers. He delivered an ultimatum to the pirates of the Caribbean from the British government. Either accept a royal pardon by September 1718 or face the hangman's noose. His first port of call was New Providence, still home to over 2,000 cutthroats. Many chose to take the pardon, but even more slipped away, including the most famous pirate of them all, Edward Teach, better known as Blackbeard.
His beard was black, which he suffered to grow of an extravagant length. In time of action, he struck lighted matches under his hat, which, appearing on each side of his face, made him altogether such a figure that imagination cannot form an idea of fury from hell to look more frightful.
I think Blackbeard got exactly the reputation that he wanted. Blackbeard was probably a better actor than I am. I think Blackbeard was a man that had the ability to take his limitations and build on them and create a character that we still remember 300 years after his death. Blackbeard perhaps never killed anyone. I don't think he was this ruthless, bloody pirate like so many of them were. He had the ability to be an evil, naughty person, but he rarely had to do that. Blackbeard was in it for the money. He was not in it for the blood.
On one infamous occasion, he was playing cards with his first mate, Israel Hans. Hans was foolish enough to call his captain's bluff, but no one crossed Blackbeard.
Tis a bad game you play, Hans.
Mr. Hans walked with a limp from that day forward. You see, I had blown his kneecap off. Oh, my reputation continued to grow. Soon I was respected as the most feared pirate who had ever set sail.
Everything about Blackbeard was excessive. Instead of wearing one pistol, he wore 6. Instead of having one wife, he had 14. Blackbeard also captured the largest ship, a French frigate, which he renamed the Queen Anne's Revenge. She had 40 guns and a crew of 300. He surrounded her with a flotilla of smaller vessels, his own pirate navy, which he used to attack over 50 ships. His blockade of Charleston, South Carolina in 1718 was his most brazen act of piracy. For 3 days, shipping came to a standstill as Blackbeard ransomed the town, threatening to burn it to the ground unless his terms were met.
They were looking for something very specific. They called it medicine. I think they were looking for drugs. Laudanum in particular, it was used until fairly recently as a pain reliever, and it is said that old Blackbeard would start his day out with a nice, tall glass of Virgin Island rum, and he'd take laudanum and mix it in with the rum and drink it.
4 days later, Blackbeard received his ransom. He had stopped all shipping for a small box of medicine worth $600. It was a deed that could not go unpunished. By the time he reached North Carolina, Blackbeard had a price on his head.
He'd realized that he had thrown up a red flag, and he was very high profile following the blockade of Charleston. And I think he came to the conclusion that it was about time to downsize the crew. So when they came up here to Beaufort Inlet, he ran the Queen Anne's Revenge aground out here on the bar.
In 1997, marine archaeologist Dave Moore and his team investigated a wreck they believed to be the Queen Anne's Revenge. They found a pair of anchors and many cannons, which suggests this was a large ship. They still need conclusive proof, but it looks as if this is the wreck of Blackbeard's ship.
This is a bronze bell that was recovered from the site. A small cannonball. Now this large cannonball here weighs approximately 24 pounds. A blunderbuss barrel made from brass, a lead sounding weight, and this is another interesting item here. It's sheet lead. It was called a cannon apron, and this would have been fashioned around or placed on top of the breech end of the gun over the touch hole. With the Queen Anne's Revenge being located, if indeed we can prove that she is, it's only the 3rd pirate ship, to my knowledge, that has been located anywhere in the world. So that certainly adds a certain amount of significance to this particular shipwreck, apart from its obvious association with Blackbeard the pirate, perhaps one of the most notorious pirates that ever sailed.
Abandoning his mothership to the elements, Blackbeard sailed north with a skeleton crew. His destination was a favourite old haunt, the remote island of Ocracoke.
The trees over here is what they call Springer's Point. This is where Blackbeard had his hideout. There's still an old well back in there from the Blackbeard days. They had this huge pirate party here on Ocracoke, and supposedly it was the largest gathering of pirates in North America. And there was talk of fortifying Ocracoke as a pirate haven, making it into a fort.
To prevent Ocracoke becoming a pirate stronghold, 2 Royal Navy sloops were sent to flush them out. They were commanded by Robert Maynard, the oldest lieutenant in the Navy, who had been passed over for promotion 4 times. He was determined not to blow this opportunity. On November 21st, 1718, Maynard reached Ocracoke and anchored off the inlet. Despite the revelry on shore, Maynard's arrival did not go unnoticed by Blackbeard.
He didn't really know who it was, but he figured they'd send somebody to kill him, so he was pretty much walking back and forth all night long. And one of the, like Ocracoke, the way Ocracoke got his name was Blackbeard was saying, "Oh, cock crow," trying to get the chicken to crow the next morning so he could see who it was they sent to kill him.
When dawn broke to reveal Maynard's puny ships with no cannons, Blackbeard's confidence grew. He would use his intimate knowledge of the treacherous waters to trap his foe.
Robert Maynard, they had to come up, tack against the wind back and forth because the channel's very narrow. And they said Blackbeard had secret channels where only he knew about, and he would trick the ships into running aground.
Blackbeard lured one of the naval sloops onto a sandbank and unleashed the power of his broadside on the stranded vessel. No one survived. As Blackbeard closed in for the kill on the second sloop, Maynard played his own trick. He ordered his crew below decks, making it appear that the ship had been abandoned. Blackbeard took the bait.
Let's board her and cut him to pieces and give no quarter! But wait, surely there was more than this on board. Where's the rest of them? Where are they? Surely they be hiding. Then from the hulls of the sloop, we were surrounded by British Marines from the bow, the stern, the port, the starboard. Why, there must have been 80 of them. Oh, there could have been no more than 18 of my men left. They fought diligently, but it grew more and more hopeless. And then, the sea began to grow red with our own blood. Lieutenant Robert Maynard of the Royal English Navy turns towards me, he does. I stare at him, he stares at me. And then his cowardly head swordsman slashes the side of me neck. I felt the bitter burn as blood started to trickle down my chest. Lieutenant Maynard takes his pistol and he aims that pistol right at my heart, and then my face splattered against those splintered boards. Then I heard the command, "Off with his head!" Seaman Chapman Gurley takes his finely honed sword and quickly, but oh so carefully he does cut Blackbeard's head from Blackbeard's body.
I'm absolutely positive that Blackbeard would not have died November 22nd, 1718, if he had not been stoned out of his noodle. Because of the alcohol, because of the laudanum, Blackbeard considered himself invincible. He had never lost a battle. Why should he lose this battle?
It is said Blackbeard refused to die. When his headless body was thrown overboard, according to legend, it swam around the sloop 7 times.
On certain nights, lights drift around Teach's Hole. It is thought to be Blackbeard's body searching for his head.
By now, Britain's wars with Europe were over, and the full might of the Royal Navy would come down on the pirates.
This ship was a gun platform. She was only designed to go from A to B and to protect the sea lanes. Any pirate that came within about a mile against this ship, 140 guns coming your way, I think perhaps you might want to turn turtle and get out quickly. I certainly would.
Against such firepower, the pirates stood little chance. Within 5 years, 3,000 pirates were captured or killed. But there was one man even the Navy feared. Ironically, he was a devout Christian who never touched alcohol. Black Bart Roberts.
Bartholomew Roberts was the most alarming and terrifying and the most successful of all the pirates. He was not the most famous. Blackbeard was much more famous. He had a good sort of propaganda machine. But Bartholomew Roberts is reputed to have attacked 400 ships in his lifetime. And I've read numerous accounts by the governors of islands. I've read captains' logbooks, and there's no doubt that he had an amazing record of attacking ships. He appears to have been a rather stern, disciplined man, fairly good looking. He was dark and saturnine. He was also extremely savage in his treatment of ships that he attacked. Cut people's ears and noses off, and on one occasion he nailed some seamen to the mast as an example. So a very terrifying character.
To add to his cold-blooded reputation, Bart Roberts was an expert navigator, crisscrossing the oceans with his fleet. His crew were united under his motto, a merry life and a short one. His flotilla swept down the west coast of Africa, systematically ransacking every port they entered. At Whydah, they found a slave galley. The pirates stripped her of all valuables, and without a care for the slaves chained below, they torched the powder kegs. "80 slaves were forced to choose between burning alive or drowning. It was one of the most callous acts of piracy ever recorded. The Navy followed Bart Roberts' trail of destruction down the coast of Africa, finally catching up with him at Cape Lopez off New Guinea. Realizing he was trapped, Bart Roberts put his faith in God to protect him in his hour of need. The prospect of a naval battle provoked a different reaction in his crew. They embarked upon what might be their last blistering night's drinking.
I think he must have realized that this was the end, really, because he was coming out to fight a disciplined naval ship. The most amazing thing is that the whole battle took place in a full gale off the coast of Africa.
gale sweeping across the decks, water everywhere.
Rather than cut and run like any other pirate, Bart Roberts ignored the storm and led his drunken crew directly into the path of the oncoming battleship. The first naval broadside delivered the inevitable carnage. Bart Roberts had fought his final battle. According to his last wish, his body was thrown overboard, so he would never be captured.
The final battle of Bartholomew Roberts, the most ferocious of the pirates, was the end of an era. From that date onwards, the Navy was simply doing a mopping up operation. And I think what my final vision of that, the end of the great age of piracy, is on the little islands outside every seaport around the coast of the Atlantic, the bodies of pirates, tarred to preserve them, being pecked by seagulls, but a warning to seamen that that's what happens to pirates.
The mass execution of 52 members of Bart Roberts' crew marked the gruesome end of the golden age of piracy. The pirates' way of life had been based on a vision of utopia, yet their high ideals of equality and fair reward were tainted by the blood of their victims. Never again would they reign with such supremacy upon the seas.
Ironically, the pirates that we are most familiar with, men like Captain Kidd, Blackbeard, Bart Roberts, were in essence losers. The successful pirates were the men who were able to operate in the shadows year after year after year. The ones that were able to make their fortunes, and finally, at the end of all that, dying peaceably in bed.